Back in 2012, I retired to the Philippines. I worked all my life back home in America, and I had a retirement pot of around $500,000. I was so excited when I finally retired. I was 56 years old, and I was ready to start a new chapter of my life. This story is not about what happened to me in the Philippines. I've been listening to all the stories on your channel, and what happened to me in the Philippines is quite similar to what happened to somebody else. But I ended up leaving the Philippines altogether and going to Colombia instead. I want to share what happened to me in Colombia. I would like to say that I lost a lot of money when I was in the Philippines. I met a girl that was everything I'd always dreamed of. She was my life, and I gave her my life, as well as about $200,000 out of my retirement savings. Just over half of that went on building a house in Leyte, where she was from. The other half went on buying a car, living expenses, and investing. She was a lot younger than I was, so she still wanted to do something, and this would be something that would haunt me later. I then find out she's in a relationship with her ex-Filipino husband, who wasn't her ex, and she had a child with him that I wasn't aware of. She kept everything a secret. When I found out, I was sitting in the house that I'd built, which belonged to her, and I was faced with the unfortunate reality that my Philippines retirement was over. She told me if I was prepared to accept her seeing her Filipino husband from time to time, that she was going to be okay to stay with me. But that was something I wouldn't even think to consider. I spent 4 years in the Philippines. Throughout that time, I developed some great friendships with other expats. I'm still in touch with quite a few of them. At a rough estimate, I would say that out of everybody I knew in the Philippines who was an expat, around 70% of them are no longer in the Philippines. Out of that 70%, about 75% of that are people who left the Philippines because of things that happened to them, which meant they were no longer able to stay there. If they were able to stay there, if their finances allowed it, then they would still be there. So that does tell you all you need to know if you're thinking about the Philippines. You can't count out that percentage of people who are still there and having a good time. It's possible, but it's not probable. I'd give up on the Philippines after what happened to me. As much as I liked it there, as much as when my girlfriend was acting like she did in the early stages of our relationship, I wasn't prepared to have another go there. There was always a chance that I would try to have a go in the Philippines, and that could go wrong as well. I wasn't prepared to take that chance, and I thought I would be better equipped going somewhere else. I wasn't yet sure where I was going to go after I left the Philippines. I had lots of ideas, but what I was certain of was I didn't want to stay in the Philippines. I left the Philippines altogether in 2016. 4 years, which started out with me being the most excited I'd ever been, finishing up with me being the most depressed I'd ever been. It was the lowest point of my life. I still had $300,000 left. I thought that was still okay to have a retirement, but the question was, where do I live? I didn't want to go back to America. There wasn't enough money left for me to live in America. I didn't want to stay in the Philippines after what had happened, and I didn't really want to go anywhere else in Asia. I did fly to Thailand after leaving the Philippines, because lots of people I spoke to in the Philippines had talked about Thailand and how it was their second choice, or for some it was their first choice. The two countries seemed to complement each other, so I had to go and check it out for myself. I liked some things about it, but it wasn't a place I could see myself living long term. The highlight of Thailand for me, though, was Pattaya. Some people liked to compare it to Angeles City, but I felt Pattaya was a lot more civilized and modern and clean and developed and safe and everything else. But even still, it was not what I was looking for. It was just too popular. And one thing I liked about the Philippines compared to Thailand was that it wasn't as popular. Thailand always seemed to feel like it was a been there, done that kind of place, and I was looking for something a bit more unique. That's when I decided that I wanted to go and try to live in Colombia instead. I'd never visited Colombia, but I'd heard about how popular it was amongst people who wanted to retire and live an affordable life. I also thought that getting into a relationship with someone from Colombia would be different than getting into a relationship with someone from Asia. I'd tried Asia and I'd failed, so it only felt right that I went somewhere else that gave me a proper chance to have a better go. I pulled myself out of the depression I was in because of what had happened to me in the Philippines, and after spending 2 weeks in Thailand and thinking it definitely wasn't a place I would want to live, I flew first to America, where I spent time with family for some weeks, pulling myself together, ready for the next adventure, and then I left America for Colombia. It was my intention to spend a bit of time in Bogota before heading to Medellin, where most people seemed to go to retire. It was going to be something very different to the Philippines, and I needed that new adventure. The Philippines had completely broken me. The relationship I was in destroyed me, yet I wanted to have a go and find a retirement that I dreamed of, and Colombia was my last chance. I landed in Bogota early in the morning. I remember that clearly because the sun was just coming up as the plane touched down at the airport. It was a pretty long flight from the States, and I was feeling tired, but also nervous in a way that I was about to start my next go at retirement. Bogota wasn't where I planned to stay when I was in Colombia, but I thought it made sense to take a few days to have a look there before heading to Medellin, where I wanted to be. I'd read online that it was a big, sprawling city, and there were some interesting places to see and some cool things to do. And it wasn't as hot as other parts of Colombia because of the high elevation. I just wanted to see it for myself and get a bit of a feel for the country before making any decisions. I can remember landing and thinking, how have I found myself here? 4 years before this, I was touching down in the Philippines for what I thought would be my final and only retirement. Yet here I was on the other side of the world having another go. If I look back at everything I do, I admire myself for having another go. I wasn't prepared to give up yet. So, would I have been better giving up after everything that went wrong in the Philippines? I probably would have been. I stayed at a cheap hotel not too far from La Candelaria. I didn't want anything too fancy and expensive. I just needed somewhere I could sleep and take a shower, and as long as it was safe and clean, that was fine with me. That part of town was older, and it had some really nice colonial buildings, great colourful streets, lots of murals, and it did remind me of parts of Manila, but without all the motorbikes and noise that you got in Manila. One of the first places I went to was Montserrat. I took the cable car up the mountain, and the view from the top was something else altogether. You could see the whole city, and Bogota is a lot bigger than I expected. Standing up there, I had that feeling like maybe I'd made the right decision coming to Colombia. But one of the things that stuck out was just how different it was to the Philippines. When you're in Manila, and also down in Leyte when I was living, when I found out the truth about my girlfriend, it wasn't very mountainous. There was nowhere, not many places you could go to get up high and see the surroundings. Yet in Colombia, everything seemed to be different. There were so many hills everywhere, and you could actually get a view of what the place was like. Yet in the Philippines, you couldn't actually get a view of what it was like because it was so flat. At least the parts of the Philippines I was in. After that, I went to the Gold Museum. I had a bit of time to kill before I needed to catch my next flight, which would take me from Bogota to Medellin, and that seemed like the best option. It was actually pretty entertaining. I was never someone who would usually go into museums, and I'd not done anything of the sorts when I was in the Philippines. But when I went in there, I did develop a newfound appreciation of places like that, and I've been in lots of museums since. Seeing all the gold artifacts and learning about the history gave me a new appreciation for Colombia, and it really seemed like the country had a lot more going on than I realized. That was one of the things that started changing how I saw Colombia. It wasn't just a place for cheap living. Perhaps that was one of the mistakes I made when I went to the Philippines. I viewed it purely as a place to go to live cheaper than how I could live in my own country. Anything to do with the history or what happened in the country, the politics, anything of the sorts, I had no interest in. It was a place where I was going to retire and live a better life than I could at home. That's it. Yet, in Colombia, I had a different attitude. It wasn't just a place I was going to live for a better retirement. It was also a place I wanted to get to know and learn about. Not that it made much difference to the ultimate outcome of my retirement there. I'd heard so much about Medellin, and the more I looked into it, the more it seemed like it might be the place where I could find comfortable retirement. The flight was only about an hour, and as soon as I landed, I felt the difference right away. The air was slightly warmer, and the people seemed kind of more laid back, and there was something about the city that gave me a different kind of energy than I'd felt in Bogota. It felt like retirement as opposed to work. I stayed at a small place in El Poblado, which I found out later was the main area for expats and tourists, and there were great views over the city from where I was staying. At first, I wasn't sure if I liked being surrounded by foreigners again, but after a couple of days and nights there, I saw why people stuck to the area. It was comfortable and clean, and it was very easy to get around, and you didn't feel like you had to watch your back all the time. That's one thing that I did feel. I'm not sure if it was justified or not because I was never robbed, but when I was walking around in Colombia, I felt more on edge than I did when I was walking around in the Philippines. I know the Philippines can also be dangerous, but it felt different in Colombia. Perhaps it was just because everything I'd seen happening in the country over the years. These were images that were difficult to shift, but that was my overall feeling. I spent the first few days just walking around and seeing what Medellin was all about. I went to Parque Leras, which is in the heart of El Poblado, and even during the day it had a kind of buzz to it that I really enjoyed. At night it changed completely. The lights came on, the music got a lot louder, and the bars started to fill up, and they were some of the places that I loved to go the most. It did remind me ever so slightly of Pattaya, but on a lot smaller scale. There were still women working the nightlife scene, but it didn't feel as transactional as it had in the Philippines. People seemed to be more open, and you could actually have a real conversation. I might have also been feeling this because I was jaded about what happened to me in the Philippines. So I was viewing things through the eyes of a guy who had put everything on this place being perfect for my retirement. There are two ways that I was looking at things, and I was trying to put these kinds of thoughts to the back of my mind because there may have been some truth to them. One of the places I liked going to was Provenza, just up the hill from Parque Leras. It had a bit more class to it, and there were cafes and restaurants where you could sit outside and watch the world go by. I started getting used to it reasonably quickly. I wasn't going out every night. After losing so much money in the Philippines, I was being very careful about what I was spending, but I did want to experience everything that Medellin had to offer before settling down and starting to live my retired life. After a week, I started seeing people that I'd seen before. It's not that I interacted with them, but I just started to recognize people who were in the same area. It felt a lot more tight-knit than where I was in the Philippines, yet it was also a very big city. It just felt more real than it did in the Philippines. It felt like it was more similar to home, yet very different to home at the same time. But some of the things I liked about Colombia to start with was the food. That was considerably better than the food in the Philippines. But most of all, just how varied it was. There were so many places to see in Colombia that I could vacation at, maybe once a year, and I am starting to really feel like I've made the right decision by going to Colombia. I guess I'd only been in Medellin for just over a month. I'd been to lots of places, I'd seen lots of things, and I decided that what happened to me in the Philippines was actually a good thing. My feelings in Colombia were that this was a lot more representative of what I expected my retirement to be. It was during that month that I came to the determination that the Philippines was just a compromise. It was a place to go that was cheap and more affordable than where I was from, but you had lots of things there that, while you were there, you thought were a bit quirky and charming, yet as soon as I was in Colombia, that's when I realized that you didn't need to make those sort of sacrifices, because here was a country that was still more cheap and affordable than where I came from, yet it had the sort of things that I could get at home. It felt more comfortable. I think that's the best way I can describe it. It also made me feel like I made the right decision. So again, I have to think, were these opinions that I was having just my mind playing tricks on me to say, don't worry about it, you lost a load of money in the Philippines, but here is very different. That's what I was thinking, but I don't know what or why I was thinking it. It was decided then. I was going to live in Colombia. More precisely, in Medellin. With the money I had left, I used some of it to get a visa. I bought a place to live in, which I did in my own name. There didn't seem to be the same kind of property restrictions in Colombia as there were in the Philippines, which was a big bonus. So I had a visa because I bought that. And I had $200,000 left. But I was happy and settled in the knowledge that I found a place where I could live within my means, and that's when I started casually dating in the hopes of meeting someone to make my retirement complete. One of the things I loved in the Philippines was the nightlife, and I loved that in Thailand. That was one of the best things about Thailand, yet everything else I felt in Thailand was a letdown. How things were, though, in Colombia was different. It wasn't as in your face as it was in the Philippines, and I found that I was meeting girls who were the type of girls that I was interested in. One of the mistakes I made in the Philippines was looking for someone that was considerably younger than I was. So in Medellin, I decided that I wouldn't look for anyone that was younger than 35. As soon as I decided to live there, that's when I started going out a lot more in the evenings, mainly around El Poblado. It was easy to meet girls who seemed to be interested in forming relationships with foreigners. I was a lot more wary in Colombia than I was in the Philippines. I was aware that there may be people who might try to scam me or rob me, and I was always very careful when I had a drink that nobody put anything in it. These were fears that I didn't have in the Philippines, and perhaps the fears I had in Colombia were completely unjustified, but they were there based on all the negative things that I've heard about the country over the years. I met quite a few girls, and I guess I had probably been living in Medellin for about 4 months when I met a girl who made me completely forget about what happened to me in the Philippines. She was 38, from the city, and her ability to speak English was better than many of the girls that I'd spoken to. My Spanish was completely non-existent, and it was harder to get about because of the language in Colombia. Yet in many scenarios you could get by with English, as long as you were going to certain places. I did vow to pick up Spanish, yet that was something I was thinking about for 3 years in the future, and I never got there. I immediately felt like this girl would make my retirement complete. I already had my apartment that I'd purchased for my visa, so having somewhere to live wasn't a problem, and it was different than when I was dating originally in the Philippines. In the Philippines, my girlfriend would always come back to my place, and I would never go to where she lived. Yet in Colombia, she invited me to where she lived. It wasn't a great place, but it was night and day better than how people lived in the Philippines. You'll have to forgive me for making these comparisons, but I'm trying to explain it from my point of view. But I went back to her place lots of times. She came to my place, and the relationship just progressed very quickly. Perhaps it progressed too quickly, and after being together for 6 months, that's when we decided to get married. I was never married to my girlfriend in the Philippines because she had a story of trying to get her marriage to her ex annulled, and it was dragging on and on. But of course, I later found out that she was still with her ex, and she had no intention of getting that marriage annulled. But I did feel like, finally, now my retirement was complete. I had enough money to last for 20 years, and I thought I had a great relationship, and I was just about ready to settle down into my permanent life as a retiree in Colombia. Then it started. I guess we'd been married for around 3 months, and I had settled into retired life. Everything was going well. My days were everything I thought that my retirement was going to be. My wife, who I'd met at that place in El Poblado, when we met, she said she worked in a cafe. I never went to visit the cafe, but as soon as she started to stay with me, she said she gave up that job because she no longer needed to do it. But now she's talking about wanting to find a job. She wants to do something to make money. She then starts talking about how, because I'm from America and she's married to me, that means that she has an advantage because she has American dollars to invest. She thought it would be a good idea to open a new business. Initially, I was very hesitant, thinking back to what happened in the Philippines. As you'd expect, I would be very hesitant. But the more she talked about it over the following months, the more I started to get drawn into the idea that she had. She always used to talk about how, when she worked in the cafe where she worked was never as good as it would have been if she was in charge. From the way that people made the coffee, to the way they interacted with the customers, everything she said would be better if she had her chance to do it her way. I really did admire her determination and grit, and I started to warm to the idea of opening a cafe. I would be completely hands off. I was retired, and I didn't really want to get involved. But when she ran the numbers by me and told me about how much money it was going to make, it did start to make sense. I did always think back to what happened in the Philippines, but at the moment, I'm happy, I'm in the moment, and I'm living for the moment. So it seemed to start to make sense because of that. She knew I had approximately $200,000, and it was my intention to just use that gradually throughout the course of my retirement. But she was always telling me that you have that money, you should invest it and use it to make more money. If you did that, you would have a business and you would have an income coming in that would last forever, as opposed to coming to an end. She told me that having a big lump sum of money was not really a good idea, because eventually it would run out. And while I knew that it would run out at some point, I wasn't expecting it to run out until I'd run out, so I wasn't overly concerned about that. But of course now I understand I'm married, and I have a wife, and I have to think about her future. Although she was 38, that was still a lot younger than I was. So if everything went normally, then she would most likely outlive me, and then what was she going to do? She would have the place that I bought, but she wouldn't have anything else. And if she didn't work for the next however many years, all of a sudden she'd be even older without any money for her retirement. When she explained it to me exactly like that, I felt like if I didn't invest in the business with her, that would be something that I should be ashamed of. She made me feel guilty by talking about her future, and by doing so, that meant that my own present was put on the line. That's the difficult truth of the situation, and I get it from her point of view, it does make sense. But from my point of view, it was a question of who do I put first, me or her? I put her first, and I agreed to let her open a cafe. It was going to be in an area very close to where we lived, in El Poblado. And one thing I found quite early on in the stage was, although it wasn't as difficult it was in America to do something like this, it was far more difficult than it was in the Philippines, where in the Philippines you could basically do something, no questions asked. In Colombia, you still need to get some kind of permission when you were doing something, and everything cost a bit more money. I agreed, though, to give her $60,000. This was the amount she kept coming back to. She said that it would be enough to get the business set up and see how things went for the first few months, while it was getting up and running, and before it started to turn a profit. It was a big chunk of my retirement savings, but I had to reason with myself that this was going to bring in more money, so there's a big chance that my retirement is going to be even better because my wife is making more money. I'm doing this thinking about the best case scenario, or even the middle ground scenario. I'm completely neglecting to think about the worst case scenario because that was unthinkable what would have happened if things didn't work. The $60,000 was meant to pay for the lease, 1 year up front for a place, as well as getting the license and a renovation and everything to get the building ready, and everything to get the business ready, including the furniture and everything like a coffee machine, absolutely everything, and paying for 2 staff members for 3 months. I was hesitant when I gave her the money, but she was so happy to have the chance to do something that she'd always wanted to do, so I left her to it. Over the next few weeks, things are coming together, and I'm going with her to see potential buildings, and one was found in a great location, and she agreed to take it on. In her business plan, she decided it wasn't going to take any longer than a month to get the renovation done and get the cafe ready to be opened. 3 months later, however, the cafe wasn't yet ready to be open, and she'd worked through the $60,000, and she hadn't got even any equipment that she needed. No coffee machine, no furniture. She'd taken on the building, paid for the lease, got the license, paid for the renovation so the building was ready, yet there was nothing else left, so I never thought that would happen. This was probably one of the worst things that could have happened. If she'd got to the point that she was meant to get to, opening and 3 months later, and it was nowhere close to working, then we could have come to the decision, okay, it didn't work, and while that would have been a devastating loss, it could have been contained. The problem now was that $60,000 had been invested, and if no more money was going to be forthcoming, then the cafe would have failed before it had even opened, and she'd have basically thrown away all the money for nothing. That's why I had to give her some more money. I was chasing after it now, and I was starting to worry already, But I still had confidence in my wife that the cafe was going to work. Everyone makes mistakes when it comes to calculating renovation costs, I get that. So I gave her the benefit of the doubt. It took $25,000 more for the cafe to be complete and ready to open, and another $10,000 to cover the first 3 months' operating costs. That meant that $95,000 had been invested in the business before we saw anything. That meant my retirement was now on the line, and it wasn't meant to be. $60,000 was meant to be the absolute maximum that I was prepared to invest, yet it got to a stage where, if it didn't work, that meant I was compelled to put in more. I felt that operating costs were quite high for what we were having to pay, and after the 3 months were up and money was coming in, it still wasn't covering the costs, so I had to ask my wife, why are these operating costs so high? She rattled off everything in front of me. The electric bill was $150, miscellaneous fees $150, the first staff we give them $400 and the other staff gets $350. Then I asked what about the rest, which was close to $2,000, and then she just said, oh, that's my salary that I'm taking for myself. She said it just like that, like it was normal. I was flabbergasted when she said that. What do you mean you're taking a salary out of money that I'd invested in the business? You only take a salary when it's turning a profit, and she gave me a blank stare. No, I started my business. That means I need to be paid for it. That's my job, and I need an income. I've been taking that money ever since I started. That's when I found out that the $60,000 that I'd given, she'd already taken 4 months' salary out of it, and nearly pocketed $20,000 total out of my entire investment, and that money had just gone. I couldn't believe that she'd done that. And at the moment, the business wasn't even covering costs to pay for everything, not even including this ridiculous salary that she had decided that she was entitled to. We fell out badly because of that. My lump sum of money had basically been split in half, and she'd helped herself to quite a lot of it, and that was a difficult time. I mean, we came round and we made up with each other not long after, and she said it was just a misunderstanding and she was sorry and she wouldn't do it again, but she couldn't pay the money back because it had already gone somewhere. Where it had gone, I don't know. But everything was arranged that she wouldn't take any more money out of the business, and because of that, and because we hadn't made any money yet, we didn't know if it was going to make money. So I put $20,000 in again, extra, and that was going to be the last money I could put in. It was all or nothing. My retirement was on the line and everything was in her hands. And it was a failure. People were going to the cafe quite regularly, but it just wasn't making enough money. It wasn't able to cover the costs, let alone provide for her and my retirement. I couldn't believe it when she came back one day and she said it was over. I'd sunk $115,000 into it, and while I still had some money left, it wasn't enough to last for the rest of my life. I was heartbroken, but I knew that I still had years before anything would go badly wrong. I'd just given up on the hope of a great retirement, but my wife was a changed woman. She was so apologetic, saying she couldn't believe that it had gone wrong. She tried her best. She had a misunderstanding that she wasn't meant to take money out of the company until it started to make a profit. She just said that because she was working there, that's the amount of salary she wanted to give herself. So even if it was making $1 million, then she would have still had the same amount. That's what she kept telling me. She told me that she was very sorry, but she wanted to make it up to me, and she really thinks that if she didn't make the same mistake she did, then she could make something else work. I don't know how she convinced me, but I think I was in one of those frames of mind where I just thought, F it, I don't care anymore. All I wanted was a retirement and a wife who was happy not to do anything in exchange for being a wife. That's all I wanted. And now I'm in a frame of mind that, well, I might as well gamble the rest because I'm going to have to do something anyway. So let her have the rest and see how it goes. There's no point going into too much detail on this one because it did fail. Of course it failed. It failed worse than the last one. It was a clothing shop that she wanted to open, and she thought it would have been great, and I gave her the money to try, and it didn't work. I'd lost all my money. I mean, I had $10,000 left, but that was nothing. What was I meant to do with that? I had my apartment, which was okay, but after this failure, my wife almost didn't look at me the same way anymore because she knew there was no more money, and that meant, what's the point in her being nice to me? 3 months later, she's out cheating on me, and that's when we had to get divorced. I was able to keep my apartment and I put it up for sale with the plans just to return home and admit defeat. And then COVID happened, and I found myself stuck there for a while, and I'm just spending as little money as I can. I eventually sold it 2 years ago. I did make a big profit on it, but that's not much comfort, and I'm back in America where I probably should have accepted that I should have stayed. My retirement failed twice, and I'm writing this now after reading back through everything I've already written, and it does sound like, how could anybody do something this stupid? But that's what I did. I was doing it in the moment, with the feelings that were thrust upon me at the time. It's very different at the time than it is looking back, so while I can look back and shake my head in disgust at the decisions I made, at the time I might excuse myself because I didn't mean for things to go so badly wrong.